On one of Glasgow's busiest streets, a charwoman was going about her work as usual. It was 30th January 1932. The next day she was found dead. Between 3 and 5 o'clock that Saturday afternoon, Hope Street was busy with shoppers. On the corner of Hope Street and West Regent Street, shop cleaner, 30-year-old Elizabeth Dodds McGill Campbell, was brutally attacked. She'd been employed as a cleaner and had been working at Farquharson Brothers, a typewriting suppliers, at 191 Hope Street, after it had closed for the day. She had arrived for her shift but had missed a 6 o'clock appointment at home. The following morning, her uncle, with whom she lived, went to the Hope Street area and spoke to a police officer who was on his rounds there. The officer opened the door to the shop and entered. To his horror, he found the woman lying dead behind an inner door of a small vestibule at the front showroom of the shop. Her head had been battered and she was covered in bruises. There was a handkerchief tied tightly round her mouth, and her hands had been bound in front of her with thick parcel cord. She was lying in a position which meant she could have been seen from the street if people had looked through the windows on the West Regent Street side when the police officer had put on the lights. The officer who discovered her contacted police headquarters immediately, and within minutes the place was swarming with detectives under Superintendent Forbes. Following a quick examination of the body, it was clear she'd been attacked, presumably by a man who'd forced his way into the shop. It was believed she'd been gagged and bound first, before being brutally attacked on the head, although no weapon was found at the scene. A heavy round ebony ruler was removed for examination. It was thought the attack took place when she'd been switching off the lights and opening the door. The evidence showed whoever it was had had a quick rummage around, but the safe remained untouched, and it appeared that nothing had been stolen. The police still suspected the motive was robbery, however, although they believed it hadn't been a premeditated murder, and that the perpetrator had possibly randomly picked up the round ruler that had simply been lying around. Perhaps she had made an attempt to free herself as the street at the time was busy, and in panic that she would raise the alarm, whoever it was had hit her. The wall and the surrounding desks were splattered with blood. Her false teeth and a few hairpins were scattered over a wide area of the floor, this showing signs that she'd struggled with her attacker, and her clothes were in disarray. She was wearing a glove on her left hand, but her right hand was bare. The keys to the office were also on her body, suggesting that the perpetrator struck when she was about to leave the office and forced himself inside. Her body was removed to the Central Police mortuary, where the surgeon confirmed that she died on Saturday. The police couldn't pinpoint whether it was one attacker or more. They believed that it would have been difficult for one man to restrain her and bind her, so there was a working theory that there was at least 2 men involved, one to hold her, while the other gagged and bound her. Then one of them had hit her over the head. One thing they found strange was that 2 men were working on the shop next door and never heard a thing, even though the murder had taken place by the dividing wall of the 2 shops. Police examined the fingerprints left on the ruler and on some desks and chairs that they removed. By the following morning, the police were looking for a man and boy who'd been seen boarding the 5:40 p.m. westbound train, which had been around the time of the murder, carrying a brown paper package containing 2 cash boxes. The description of the man and boy was circulated, and the public asked for their help in identifying them. The man was described as being 25 to 30, roughly 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a medium build and wearing dark clothing. He also wore a soft grey hat. The boy was between 16 and 18 and was also wearing dark clothes. On the Monday morning, a young gardener at Kelvin Grove Park, Robert Wiley, found one of the cash boxes discarded beneath bushes. It belonged to Farquharsons and had been prized open. Inside was a bundle of insurance cards, and it was reported both boxes only contained small sums of money. Meanwhile, back at the offices, the city police had called in a fingerprint expert from Sheffield who examined the site. Prints were found on a desk. The entire force under Captain P.J. Silto, the chief constable, scoured the city overnight, visiting lodging houses and low-class hotels, and managed to establish Miss Campbell's movements. At 4 o'clock she'd left her home at 11 Weems Street, and it took her an hour to get to work. When she didn't return, her aunt and uncle thought nothing of it, as sometimes she went to a friend's house on a Saturday night and stayed until late. They had gone to this friend's house only to discover she hadn't turned up. Her uncle called her brother, but he couldn't shed any light on the matter. That was when the police became involved. During investigations, a young woman came forward stating she'd seen 2 people emerging from the offices, and it aroused her suspicion that a robbery had occurred. Along with a man who was also passing at the time, they peered through the window, but the gloom inside made it difficult to see if there was anything amiss. There was no sign of damage of the door or anything else wrong, so they left. At this point, it was thought Miss Campbell was still alive, but passed away later on the Saturday night. On 18th April 1932, at the High Court in Glasgow, 19-year-old George McCudden and 18-year-old Andrew Cameron stood trial before Robert Blackburn, Lord Blackburn, on charges of murder and theft. A friend of the two, James Kirkton, told the court that he'd been asked by McCudden to keep an eye outside the office while he and Cameron did a job. He left, though, not believing they would carry it out. On the Saturday night, he met Cameron, who told him the woman had put up a fight. There was also blood on Cameron's sleeves, which he told him had happened when he'd held her head after she'd been struck. Later that same night, the witness met McCudden, whose hands were swollen. He said McCudden had told him she'd bitten him, and he'd stuffed a handkerchief into her mouth and struck her with a mallet. The mallet had been no use, so he'd picked up the ruler to quieten her. McCudden's defence solicitor, Mr. Payton, King's Counsel, told the jury he'd been appalled at the indictment and spoke of the young man's character. He'd done well at school, had been employed for 4 years, and had been well behaved, reliable and trustworthy. But the jury were having none of it. On 20th April they were found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging on 11th May. It had taken the jury just 50 minutes to deliberate and come to their verdict, it being a majority vote. As the foreman spoke, his voice quavered. He told the court the jury wished to recommend leniency and mercy. This had no effect on the judge. He turned to McCudden and Cameron and told them, "The crime of which you have been found guilty is so deliberate, so cowardly and so callous that it may be considered that no clemency whatsoever should be extended to you." Lord Blackburn then lifted the black cap. However, a petition with over 50,000 signatures called for a reprieve, and this was granted by the King, and the Secretary of State for Scotland wrote to the Provost of Glasgow advising him of the decision. The sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. This was the first case in the city where a microphotography expert was used, making it one of Glasgow's most important criminal cases. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.